They said loyalty fades with time, but no one told them it sometimes shows up in silence. The morning sky over Arlington National Cemetery carried a soft gray stillness, the kind that felt heavier than words, as if even the wind had chosen to lower its voice out of respect. Rows of white marble headstones stretched across the rolling green like an endless formation of silent honor guards, each one marking a story that ended too soon, yet refused to disappear. Today, Staff Sergeant Daniel Cooper stood among them in a pressed Marine dress uniform, his posture straight, but his eyes carrying the quiet weight of a man who had learned how to stand still even when everything inside him kept moving. Around him, fellow Marines formed a careful semicircle near a flag-draped casket, their movements precise, deliberate, restrained in the way only those trained in discipline and grief could be. The air smelled faintly of damp grass and polished wood, mixed with the distant sound of a lone bugle warming up somewhere beyond the trees. No one spoke louder than a whisper. No one needed to. And yet, before the ceremony could fully settle into its rhythm, something unexpected cut through the stillness. It wasn't a sound at first, but a presence, subtle enough that only those trained to notice the smallest shift in their environment felt it. A pause in breath, a slight turn of heads. Then came the sight. At the edge of the formation, just beyond the line of folded flags and uniformed shoulders, a white German shepherd stood perfectly still, as if it had always belonged there. Its coat was unusually pale, almost luminous against the muted tones of the cemetery, catching the weak sunlight in a way that made it seem less like an animal and more like a memory given form. No leash, no handler, no hesitation. It simply stood there, facing forward, aligned with the direction of the casket as though it understood exactly where it was supposed to be. Captain Ryan Miller was the first to notice fully, his brows tightening slightly as he leaned just enough to murmur toward a nearby Marine, but no one answered him. The dog's presence carried its own kind of authority, one that did not demand permission. Daniel Cooper felt it before he saw it clearly. A shift deep in his chest, subtle at first, like the echo of a name he had not spoken aloud in a long time. His eyes lifted slowly, tracing past the rows of uniforms until they landed on the white figure standing at attention near the front. For a moment, the world narrowed. The distant bugle, the breeze through the trees, the quiet shuffle of dress shoes on grass, all of it fading into something far away and unimportant. The dog tilted its head slightly, just enough to reveal a collar that caught the light in a dull metallic glint, worn at the edges, marked by time and travel. Daniel's breath slowed without permission, his mind searching through corridors of memory he had kept sealed behind duty and routine. Afghanistan. Dust-heavy air. Night operations where silence meant survival. And there, always there, moving beside him like a shadow made of instinct and trust, had been Blizzard. A K-9 unit assigned to his team, trained for detection, but remembered for something no training could define. Presence, loyalty, an unspoken understanding that never needed command. The memory hit softly, not like a wound, but like the sudden warmth of something long thought lost. Blizzard had been reported gone after their final mission together, a moment filed away in official language that never felt complete. And yet here, in this place where endings were meant to remain final, something about the way the dog stood made Daniel's certainty fracture. The white German shepherd took one slow step forward, then another, each movement controlled, deliberate, until it stood just outside the nearest row of folding chairs. No one moved to stop it. No one seemed able to. It wasn't defiance that held them still, but something closer to recognition without explanation, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something that belonged to a different kind of order. Daniel's gaze dropped to the collar again, and though he could not yet read it from this distance, something in him already knew he would. The ceremony had not yet begun its final words, but the silence had already changed shape, stretching wider, deeper, filled with the quiet tension of something about to be remembered rather than revealed. Captain Ryan Miller's voice broke the stillness first, low and controlled, but edged with uncertainty as he leaned slightly toward Daniel Cooper and said that the animal standing near the front formation did not belong to any assigned military unit on record, yet no one moved to remove it, as if the cemetery itself had decided to pause and observe what would happen next. Daniel did not respond immediately. His eyes remained locked on the white German shepherd, and something in the way it held its posture began to feel less like coincidence and more like memory pressed into physical form. The dog's stance was too precise for chance, its weight evenly distributed, head slightly lowered, ears forward, as though it had been trained to understand ceremony, silence, and loss. Around them, Marines exchanged brief glances that said more than words ever could, small shifts in shoulders, subtle tightening of jawlines, the kind of reactions that came when discipline met something it could not categorize. The wind moved gently through the cemetery, brushing across the rows of headstones like a passing hand, and the distant sound of a flag rope tapping softly against a pole added rhythm to the quiet tension building in the air. Daniel finally took a slow step forward, not toward the casket, but toward the edge of the formation where the animal stood, his boots pressing softly into the damp grass. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of physical weight, but because recognition was beginning to form in places he had not opened in years. The dog did not retreat. Instead, it turned its head slightly, just enough for Daniel to see the worn metal collar more clearly now, dulled by time but still intact, its surface carrying faint engravings that caught fragments of light as it moved. The engraving was not fully visible yet, but the shape of it was enough to send a subtle tremor through Daniel's breathing, a shift so small it would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. Captain Miller followed a few steps behind, maintaining distance but observing carefully, his expression tightening, as though he too was trying to connect something that did not yet fit. A nearby Marine whispered something under his breath, but the words dissolved into the air before they could matter. The white German shepherd took another step forward, slow and deliberate, then stopped again directly aligned with the flag draped over the casket, its gaze fixed not on the crowd, but on something beyond it, something only it seemed to see clearly. Daniel's mind began to move faster than his body, pulling fragments from memory that had been locked behind years of service. Afghanistan. Night operations under shifting desert wind. The faint sound of radio static in his ear. And always, moving beside him through dust and uncertainty, was Blizzard, the K-9 partner assigned to his unit, trained for detection work, but remembered for something far more difficult to define, a presence that made silence feel less like absence and more like protection. Daniel remembered the weight of trust without instruction, the way the dog had responded not only to commands but to intention, as if it understood thought before speech. He remembered the final mission report, the official wording that stated loss of contact during extraction, the kind of language that left no space for questions but never fully closed the door on them either. His gaze dropped again to the collar, and this time, as the dog subtly shifted its head, the engraved letters caught the light just enough for him to begin reading fragments of what had once been familiar identification. The air seemed to tighten around his chest, not with fear, but with something closer to disbelief struggling to find form. Around them, the ceremony remained suspended, the honor guard waiting for a signal that no one seemed willing to give, as if even protocol was unsure how to proceed in the presence of something that did not fit its structure. The German shepherd finally lowered its head slightly, not in submission, but in recognition, as though it had arrived exactly where it was always meant to be. Daniel stood motionless, his hand hovering at his side without realizing it had moved. Every instinct in him pulled toward understanding what his eyes were now refusing to deny. The name was not spoken yet, but it was already there, forming silently between memory and reality, waiting for the moment it would finally be acknowledged. Daniel Cooper's hand finally moved, not in certainty, but in instinct, as if something deeper than thought had taken control of his body and was guiding him forward through the thin corridor of silence that separated him from the white German shepherd standing near the front of the formation. Each step felt suspended, like time itself had slowed to make room for something that did not yet have a name. Around him, the Marines remained still, their attention divided between protocol and the quiet unfolding of something no one had been briefed for. Captain Ryan Miller watched closely, his expression no longer only uncertain, but now measured with a kind of restrained disbelief, as if he understood that whatever was happening could not be corrected by command. Daniel stopped a few feet away from the animal. The German shepherd did not move away. It only lifted its head slightly higher, as though it had been waiting for this exact distance to close for a long time. The cemetery seemed to hold its breath with them. Every sound softened into irrelevance except the faint rustle of wind moving through grass. Daniel's eyes lowered to the collar again, and this time the engraved letters became clearer, not fully revealed yet, but enough to pull something sharp and familiar from deep within him. His breathing slowed, then tightened, then slowed again, caught between recognition and disbelief. The name was there, or part of it, fractured by time and wear, but unmistakably tied to a memory he had refused to revisit since the last deployment. Blizzard. The name did not arrive like a thought. It arrived like impact, silent but absolute, collapsing distance between past and present in a single unbearable instant. Daniel's throat tightened slightly, though he did not speak. Instead, his eyes traced the dog's face, searching for confirmation in details only memory could understand. The shape of the muzzle, the slight tilt of the ears, the steady calm in its gaze that had once mirrored every step. He took through uncertain ground. Around them, Captain Miller shifted his weight and stepped half a pace closer, his voice low as he asked if Daniel was certain he recognized the animal. Daniel did not answer immediately. His focus remained locked, not on the question, but on the impossibility standing directly in front of him. The white German shepherd took a slow step forward, closing the distance by just a few inches, then stopped again, as if respecting something unspoken between them. Daniel's hand lifted slightly before he realized it was moving, fingers hovering in the air as though approaching something fragile, something that might disappear if touched too quickly. The cemetery behind them remained unchanged, yet everything within it felt different, as if the ceremony itself had shifted to accommodate a truth that was not meant to be witnessed in this way. Daniel's mind continued to pull fragments together, not in order, but in waves. The training grounds, the long nights of field operations, the quiet presence that never needed correction. Blizzard had always responded without hesitation, not to command alone, but to intent, as if trust had been established beyond language. And now, standing here in this place of final honors, that same presence was undeniable. The dog lowered its head slightly, not in submission but in recognition, and for a brief moment, Daniel felt something inside him break through years of disciplined containment. Not grief exactly, but something deeper, something closer to return. Captain Miller's voice faded into the background as Daniel finally stepped closer, close enough now that the faint details of the collar were no longer uncertain. The engraving was worn, but real, and it carried the weight of identification that could not be dismissed. Daniel's lips parted slightly, though no sound came out at first, as if his body was still catching up to what his mind already knew. The German shepherd remained still, unwavering, its gaze fixed on him with a calm that felt almost human in its patience. And in that shared stillness, surrounded by rows of silent stone and folded flags, Daniel understood that this moment was not asking for explanation, only acknowledgement. The past had not returned as memory alone. It had returned as presence. Daniel Cooper stood frozen for a moment that felt longer than time itself, his eyes locked on the white German shepherd as the world around him seemed to soften into a distant blur of uniforms, headstones, and muted ceremony sounds that no longer felt important. The only thing that remained sharp was the presence in front of him, steady and real, breathing in a rhythm he suddenly recognized deep in his memory. Captain Ryan Miller stepped closer from the side, his voice careful and controlled as he asked Daniel again if he was absolutely certain about what he was seeing. But Daniel did not respond right away because something inside him was shifting too quickly to put into words. The dog took another slow step forward, then stopped directly in front of Daniel, lifting its head just enough that the light caught the worn metal collar more clearly. This time there was no doubt. The engraving was partially faded, but the structure of the letters was still there, shaped by time, but not erased by it. Daniel's breath caught slightly as he read what he could, and in that instant his mind collapsed backward into memory without permission. Afghanistan returned not as a place, but as sensation, dust in the air, radio static cutting through night silence, the weight of moving through uncertain terrain with a partner who never hesitated beside him. Blizzard had always moved like an extension of instinct itself, not following behind, but moving in sync as if both of them shared the same unseen rhythm. Daniel's hand lowered slowly, trembling just slightly now, until his fingers hovered closer to the dog's collar. The German shepherd did not flinch. It only remained still, watching him with a focus that felt impossibly familiar, as if it had been waiting through years of distance for this exact recognition. Around them, the Marines remained silent, the ceremony forgotten in suspended form, every eye now drawn to the interaction unfolding in front of the flag-draped casket. Captain Miller's expression tightened as he observed the collar more closely from where he stood, and he signaled subtly for one of the nearby personnel to remain alert, though there was no threat in the air, only something far more uncertain. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low and unsteady, the first words barely more than a breath as he said the name Blizzard without fully realizing he had said it aloud. The moment the name left his lips, the German shepherd responded, not with sudden movement, but with a subtle shift that only someone who had known it before would recognize, a soft forward lean, a stillness that carried acknowledgement rather than reaction. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, not pain, but recognition breaking through layers of disciplined distance he had built over years of service. He took a slow step closer until he was within arm's reach, and then paused again as if asking permission without words. The dog lowered its head slightly, pressing just enough forward that the space between them disappeared. The contact was light, deliberate, and calm, and in that instant something inside Daniel finally broke open in silence. He placed his hand gently on the dog's head, feeling the texture of the white fur beneath his palm, real and grounding in a way that made everything else feel distant and unreal. Around them, the cemetery remained still, but the atmosphere had changed completely, as if the weight of memory itself had shifted into the present moment. Captain Miller said nothing now, only watching as understanding slowly replaced uncertainty across his expression. Daniel kept his hand steady on the dog, his breathing uneven but controlled, as if he were afraid that any sudden movement might dissolve what he was feeling into imagination. The German shepherd remained close, not pressing forward further, but not leaving either, as if it understood that this moment required stillness more than anything else. In the distance, the bugle finally began to sound, but even its notes felt different now, less like ceremony and more like acknowledgement. Daniel did not look away. He stayed where he was, hand resting on the white fur, feeling the quiet certainty that what he had thought was lost had somehow found its way back to him in a place where endings were supposed to remain final. Daniel Cooper's hand remained resting on the white German shepherd's head, but now the touch felt different, not like discovery anymore, but like confirmation settling deep into a place inside him that had been silent for years. The world around him slowly returned in fragments, the distant sound of the bugle continuing its ceremony, the soft shift of uniforms as Marines stood still in formation, and the faint rustle of wind moving through the rows of headstones. Yet none of it felt strong enough to pull him away from what was happening in front of him. Blizzard did not move away. It stayed close, calm, grounded, its breathing steady as if it had never once been gone from this moment, as if the distance between war and today had never existed at all. Captain Ryan Miller stood a few feet behind Daniel now, his posture unchanged but his expression noticeably softer, as though the tension of uncertainty had begun to give way to something quieter and harder to define. Daniel slowly lowered his hand, only to bring it back again, this time resting it more firmly against the dog's neck, feeling the worn collar beneath the fur once more. The engraving was clearer now at this distance, and even though time had dulled parts of it, the structure of identification was unmistakable. It carried the weight of a unit he remembered, a designation that tied directly back to moments he had thought were sealed forever. Daniel exhaled slowly, his voice barely audible as he repeated the name again, not as a question this time, but as recognition taking full shape inside him. Blizzard responded by leaning slightly closer, pressing its presence into his hand with a calm certainty that needed no explanation. Around them, the Marines remained still, their attention fully drawn now not to the ceremony, but to something unfolding quietly at its edge that felt more powerful than any formal procedure. Captain Miller finally spoke again, his tone lower now, asking if Daniel could explain how this was possible, but Daniel only shook his head slightly, because explanation no longer felt like the right language for what he was experiencing. His mind was no longer searching for how, but instead settling into the fact that the impossible had already arrived and was standing in front of him, breathing calmly as if it had never left. The cemetery itself seemed to shift with that realization, the weight of silence becoming heavier but not uncomfortable, more like reverence deepening across every row of stone. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly against the collar as another wave of memory surfaced, not chaotic this time, but precise, moments of training, movement, trust built under pressure that required no speech. Blizzard had always understood without needing direction, responding not to words alone but to presence, and now that same understanding felt intact, unchanged by time or absence. Daniel looked down at the dog's eyes again, and in them he saw something steady, something that carried no confusion, only recognition that matched his own. The bugle's final notes began to fade in the distance, signaling the continuation of the ceremony, but Daniel did not move back into formation. He stayed where he was, grounded by the weight of what his hand still held. Blizzard remained with him, still and present, as if waiting for nothing more than acknowledgement to become complete. Captain Miller eventually stepped back half a pace, allowing the moment to exist without interruption, his silence now carrying understanding rather than uncertainty. Daniel finally spoke again, not loudly, but clearly enough that only those closest could hear, and what he said was not a question this time either, but a quiet acceptance of something he could no longer deny. Blizzard was here, not as memory, not as report, but as presence standing in front of him in the cold morning air of Arlington, where names were meant to end, but somehow did not. The silence that followed Daniel Cooper's words felt different now, no longer tense or uncertain, but deeply settled, as if the entire cemetery had accepted a truth that did not require further explanation. Blizzard remained close, its white coat shifting slightly with the wind, but its posture unchanged, steady and grounded beside Daniel, as though it had never once been separated from him by years or distance. Daniel's hand still rested lightly on the dog's neck, and even though he was aware of the ceremony continuing behind him, it felt distant, like a memory happening in another place rather than a present moment unfolding around him. Captain Ryan Miller stood a few steps back, no longer attempting to interrupt or question, his stance softened by something that resembled understanding mixed with quiet disbelief. The Marines in formation remained still, their attention divided between duty and the scene unfolding at the edge of it, as if they were witnessing something that did not belong to protocol, but still deserved respect. Daniel finally lowered his hand from Blizzard's collar, but the dog did not step away. Instead, it stayed exactly where it was, calm and unwavering, its gaze still fixed on him with a recognition that felt complete and unquestioning. Daniel exhaled slowly, his eyes dropping for a moment before returning to the dog, as if confirming again that what he was seeing was not a fragment of memory, but something physically present. Around them, the distant sound of the ceremony continued, the faint movement of flags and the soft shifting of boots on grass blending into a background that no longer demanded attention. Blizzard shifted slightly forward, closing the small space between them, and pressed its head gently against Daniel's arm again, a simple gesture that carried more weight than anything spoken aloud. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in disbelief anymore, but in recognition settling into acceptance, as though every unanswered question he had carried for years had finally chosen a place to rest. Captain Miller stepped forward just enough to stand beside Daniel now, his voice quiet as he asked if Daniel needed time, but Daniel shook his head slightly, because time no longer felt like something he needed in this moment. Everything had already arrived. Everything that mattered was standing beside him in the form of a white German shepherd that should not have been here, yet was. The wind moved gently across the cemetery again, carrying with it the distant sound of the bugle reaching its final note, and for a brief moment, it felt as if even the air itself was holding still to witness what came next. Daniel slowly straightened his posture, not breaking contact with Blizzard, but allowing his presence to settle into the space between duty and memory. The dog remained calm, matching his stillness completely, as if the years between them had never broken anything that mattered. Around them, the ceremony continued in quiet respect, but it was no longer the center of anything. What stood at the center now was something quieter, something unspoken, something that had returned without announcement and refused to leave again. Daniel looked down one last time, his expression no longer searching, only certain, and in that moment, the understanding between them did not need confirmation. Blizzard was home. Daniel Cooper remained standing beside Blizzard as the final part of the ceremony continued in the distance, the sound of the bugle now fading into a long, soft echo that seemed to hang over the cemetery rather than end it. The air felt stiller than before, as if everything had shifted into a quieter state of understanding, where even movement carried meaning. Blizzard stayed close to Daniel's side, not pacing, not wandering, only existing there with a calm presence that felt steady enough to anchor the moment itself. Daniel's hand rested loosely near the dog's shoulder now, no longer searching for proof, because what he needed had already been given without conditions. Captain Ryan Miller observed them from a few steps away, his posture still formal, but his expression softened in a way that suggested the ceremony had become something different for him as well, something less about protocol and more about witnessing. Around them, Marines stood in respectful silence, their attention no longer focused on formation, but on the space between Daniel and the white German shepherd that had somehow become the center of everything without asking for it. Daniel finally took a slow breath, deeper than before, as though he was allowing himself to fully return to the present after years of carrying something unresolved. Blizzard responded by shifting slightly closer again, its shoulder brushing lightly against Daniel's leg. A simple contact that carried the weight of familiarity stronger than any spoken confirmation could provide. Daniel looked down at the dog, his eyes steady now, not searching for answers, but recognizing that there were none left to find. The past had already answered itself in the only way it could. Captain Miller stepped forward just enough to stand beside Daniel, his voice quiet as he acknowledged that whatever this moment was, it was beyond explanation, and Daniel gave a slight nod without taking his eyes off Blizzard. The cemetery around them remained unchanged in structure, but the feeling within it had shifted completely, as if the presence of something long thought lost had rewritten the emotional weight of the place itself. Blizzard remained calm, its breathing slow and even, eyes fixed on Daniel with a quiet certainty that did not waver, as though it understood that nothing more needed to be proven. Daniel slowly lowered himself into a more relaxed stance, not kneeling, but easing the tension in his body that he had carried without realizing it for years. His hand rose again briefly, resting once more on Blizzard's head, and this time there was no hesitation in the motion, only acceptance. The dog did not react beyond a subtle lean into the touch, as if it had been waiting for that exact moment of release. Around them, the Marines gradually returned their attention to the ceremony, but the atmosphere had changed permanently, no longer centered on loss alone, but on something quieter that resembled return. Daniel's gaze softened as he kept his hand on Blizzard, his voice finally breaking the silence in a tone that was barely more than breath, not asking anything, only acknowledging what stood in front of him. Blizzard stayed still, unmoving, present, as if it had never once left the side of the man it had chosen long before time created distance between them. And in that shared stillness, beneath the gray sky of Arlington, the meaning of loyalty no longer felt like memory, but like something that had found its way back to where it was always meant to be. Daniel Cooper stood in the same place long after the ceremony had technically moved forward, but time no longer felt structured in the way it had before. It moved in softer waves now, shaped by presence rather than schedule. Blizzard remained beside him, steady and calm, its white coat shifting gently in the light breeze that passed through Arlington National Cemetery. The rows of headstones in the distance no longer felt like background. They felt like witnesses. Captain Ryan Miller approached again, this time not with urgency, but with quiet intention, holding a small handheld device used for identification verification within military records. His steps slowed as he reached Daniel's side, as if he understood that whatever came next needed to be handled with care rather than protocol alone. Daniel glanced at him briefly, then back at Blizzard, whose gaze remained fixed on him with unwavering calm. Miller spoke softly, explaining that if there was any possibility of confirming the K-9 status, the record would need to be checked against old deployment archives, particularly units assigned to Daniel's previous operational history. Daniel gave a slight nod, though his attention did not fully leave Blizzard. The dog shifted once, not out of discomfort, but as if aware that something formal was about to intersect with something deeply personal. A few steps away, another Marine technician opened a secure tablet and began cross-referencing service records tied to K-9 units deployed in Afghanistan during Daniel's tour. The sound of tapping keys felt distant, almost unreal in contrast to the stillness between Daniel and Blizzard. Daniel finally knelt slightly, bringing himself closer to the dog's eye level. Blizzard responded by lowering its head just enough to meet him directly, their gaze aligning in a way that made everything else feel secondary. Daniel spoke quietly, not as an order or question, but as something closer to acknowledgement, saying the name Blizzard once more, as if confirming that saying it again would make it more real. The dog did not react dramatically. It only remained present, calm, and steady, as though it had always understood that names were not what defined recognition, but presence was. Behind them, Captain Miller received a subtle signal from the technician, who had pulled partial archival data. There was a pause before Miller spoke again, his voice lower than before, stating that there was indeed a historical record of a K-9 unit under that designation, assigned to Daniel's former operational team, though the record indicated loss during extraction and no formal recovery documentation afterward. The words were clinical, but they landed differently now, because the living presence beside Daniel contradicted the finality they had once represented. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he placed his hand gently again on Blizzard's neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath the fur, grounding himself in something that no document could override. Blizzard leaned slightly into his touch, as if reinforcing what records could not express. Around them, the Marines who had once observed in silence now stood with a different kind of attention, no longer focused on uncertainty, but on the quiet weight of something that had crossed the boundary between memory and reality. The technician continued reviewing secondary notes, confirming unit insignia and training signatures that matched Blizzard's behavioral profile and physical markings, though even he seemed aware that what he was reading was no longer just data. It was confirmation of something already felt. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice steady but low, acknowledging that Blizzard had always been more than a partner in the field, and that some connections did not end simply because distance or time declared them over. Captain Miller did not interrupt. He only nodded once, slowly, as if accepting that this moment existed outside of standard procedure. Blizzard remained still, its head resting lightly near Daniel's arm now, breathing calm and even, as if it had found the only place it needed to be. The ceremony behind them continued in its final stages, but it no longer defined the moment. What defined it now was the quiet understanding between a man and a presence that had returned without announcement, standing in the gray light of Arlington not as memory, but as something unmistakably real. Daniel Cooper remained, still for a long moment after the last confirmation had been spoken, as if the world itself was waiting to see whether he would accept what was standing in front of him or continue treating it as something impossible. Blizzard stayed close, its presence calm and unwavering, the white fur shifting gently with each soft movement of air that passed through Arlington National Cemetery. The distant ceremony had reached a quieter phase now, with Marines standing in respectful stillness as the final honors continued, but none of it held Daniel's attention anymore. Everything he was, everything he had carried for years without resolution, was now focused on the living presence beside him. Captain Ryan Miller stood a few feet away, no longer attempting to interpret or verify, only observing with the quiet understanding of someone who recognized that not every moment could be contained within procedure. Daniel finally exhaled slowly, the breath heavier than expected, as if something deep inside him had loosened after being held for far too long. He lowered his hand from Blizzard's neck for only a moment, then placed it back again, slower this time, more certain, as if confirming to himself that nothing about this presence would disappear when touched. Blizzard responded with the same steady calm, pressing slightly closer, its head angled toward Daniel in a way that felt familiar beyond logic. The technician nearby completed the final cross-reference on the military archive system, confirming once again that the K-9 designation matched historical deployment records tied to Daniel's unit, though official documentation still listed the animal as lost during mission extraction years earlier. The contradiction hung in the air without needing explanation, because the truth of what stood in front of them had already overridden what was written in files. Daniel slowly knelt again, this time fully, bringing himself level with Blizzard as the rest of the cemetery seemed to fall away into a distant blur of stone, flag, and sky. The dog remained perfectly still, watching him with a depth of recognition that did not require language. Daniel's voice came softly, not as command or disbelief, but as something closer to release, as if he had been holding the name inside him for years without ever knowing it could be answered. Blizzard did not move at first, only holding his gaze, and then it stepped forward one final time, closing the remaining distance between them until there was no space left for doubt. Daniel placed both hands gently on the dog's shoulders, his forehead lowering until it rested briefly against Blizzard's head. The moment was silent, but it carried a weight that felt heavier than sound could express. Around them, the Marines remained motionless, witnessing without interruption, as even Captain Miller chose not to speak, allowing the moment to exist without structure or command. Blizzard stood firm, unmoving, as if it had always known this would be the place where distance ended. Daniel finally lifted his head slightly, his expression no longer searching or uncertain, but fully present in a way it had not been for years. The wind passed once more through Arlington, brushing softly across uniforms and grass, and in that movement there was no feeling of loss anymore, only return. Blizzard stayed beside him, steady and real, as the final silence of the ceremony settled not on absence, but on recognition, as if something long fractured had quietly become whole again in the only way it ever could.